thank you. I've been here in Florida for a little over 4 years. I'm currently sitting in my home in Coral Gables, and I must admit, although it was pouring all day yesterday, it's a beautiful day, and I'm thrilled to be here. And This is my sixth posting abroad with the Canadian Foreign Service, and I'm very lucky that having had two postings in Latin America, because here I am in Miami, back in Latin America, so close to the United States and so close to the Caribbean, where we do a lot of business as well. So from my point of view, my background is that I'm a trade person, and I have done trade policy, business development, trade advocacy when I was in Washington, and even trade regulatory work. I worked on export controls part of the time that I was in Canada. I also worked on the Arctic, which is another area where we have something in common with the US. And even we did a little work on trade there too, because in Canada we've been working very hard to support our Indigenous peoples doing trade. But I guess perhaps because of my background in trade, I find it such a pleasure to have had several chances to meet Laura. And I must admit, not only at Go for the Greens, she spoke at a very big conference here for International Women's Day a couple of years ago here in Miami for the World Trade Center. I have had the most contact with you here, Laura, through Go for the Greens, and we had a wonderful conversation last year about the work that Laura was doing in trade policy, which can be a very esoteric topic for a lot of people. They don't really understand it, and it comes up with free trade agreements that sound like they're important, but they not always clear what they do for them in business. And I find that talking to Laura, we both get excited about what these trade agreements really can do. And I think what we've seen, and I must say partly through the new USMCA, real efforts to be more inclusive in helping give the benefits that free trade policy, when it's really negotiated well, can give to small business and women-owned business. And Laurel and I had a great conversation about that last year, and I know I'm going to have a chance to talk to Maria Luisa about that a little bit more later today. Having had such a great conversation with Laura last year, I have to say I'm glad I saw her CV after the fact, because that's quite an intimidating CV. She's currently the Chief of Corporate Affairs, Communications and Sustainability for UPS. I think this combination of public sector and private sector service that Laura has done really explains the base for both her knowledge and her passion for what trade can do for people. She was a trade negotiator at USTR while she was in the Foreign Service, and served abroad, so she understands international work both domestically and from the international perspective, having served in both Rwanda and Colombia, both very interesting places to learn those both trade and other aspects of international work. Now in the private sector, she's chairman of the International Policy Committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I think that I've always seen how active the U.S. Chamber has been and informed on these issues. And she's a member of the board there. She also has worked with the German American Business Council, having, I believe, grown up partly in Germany. And she has that kind of a specific, again, personal understanding of the international scope of business. And in 2016, she served as corporate chair of the Global Partnership Initiative for Refugees International, and continues her volunteer efforts in support of refugees. And again, I think what's impressive about this background that you have, Laura, is how broad it is and how international from every aspect it is. And I think when you're in trade, it really helps to have that breadth of experience and depth of experience. She's also married to an ex-Marine, which goes to my point that trade and security often go together, and is a mother of 2 daughters, and one more impressive fact, a 2-time Ironman triathlon finisher. So, Laura, what a CV. I just had to go into more detail than I usually do because I loved your CV so much. But again, most of all, what I enjoy is how both personally and professionally, you are so international and so actively working with women in the public sector and especially in the private sector to see how we can work together. And I truly believe in this, and I think you're a tremendous spokeswoman for all of us. And so with that introduction, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Suzanne. And I have to tell you that I would be giving you a hug right now, but just because, you know, we're virtual, we can't do that. But I am just so excited to be here. And I will admit, I'd love to be at Disney right now, but I think the technology allows us to connect. And if there's an upside to this pandemic, it's that we've learned new ways to make those connections that I think are just so critical and so powerful for really advancing the interests of women in trade. And I guess that's the topic that I wanted to touch on, because as Susan said, I am so passionate about global trade and advancing gender equity. And as Susan said, I mean, we made great strides with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement in terms of being able to address a lot of the issues that allow for trade to be more inclusive, that we have so much more work to be done. And in a lot of the advocacy efforts that I do on this topic, sometimes I've got to like back up and help people understand the why. Why do we want gender equity in global trade? And when I look at it, I mean, you think about it, the global rise of e-commerce has enabled so many companies of every single size to be able to tap into the world of international business and be able to trade like never before. And I think that's a powerful enabler for all businesses. And I think that small and medium-sized businesses especially have benefited from the tools of e-commerce. And what we've seen because of e-commerce is that it's spurred jobs and it's spurred economic growth in communities all over the world. But here's the problem. Much of that potential just is untapped if half of the population has limited or no access to the global marketplace. And here I'm talking about women. I mean, from the perspective of my international career, I've seen it. And I've recognized that if only we could empower more women to engage in trade, what a better place so many communities would be. But a lot of times you've got to convince, you know, the powers that be why they need to act on this. And there was a really powerful study done by McKinsey in 2015, and it found that if women and men participated equally in the global economy, global annual GDP would increase by $28 trillion. That's 26% by 2025. And when you think about it, in light of the pandemic, who doesn't want to tap into that economic potential? And who can be the greatest source of economic recovery? I would argue it's women-owned exporting businesses. They can be the biggest drivers of growth, but we've got to be able to eliminate a lot of the barriers that they face. And I would say, and I know it's not a news flash for anybody watching virtually, I mean, women-owned businesses deliver better. They tend to export, when they export, they tend to pay higher wages, they employ more people, they deliver higher productivity, and they report higher sales than any of their non-exporting counterparts. So we got to get women into the exporting game. There was another really important study that was done, and it was done by the World Economic Forum, and it's called the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, and it was released in 2020. And I'd encourage all of you to check it out, because it also, substantiates that really strong correlation between a country's gender gap and its economic performance. And so, what does this all mean? It means that gender parity has a fundamental bearing on whether or not economies and societies are going to thrive. And in a post-COVID-19 world, we've got to be enabling that kind of economic recovery. And it comes through gender-based equity being advanced. The problem is there's so many laws on the books that are gender biased, and there's so many procurement processes that just prevent women from entering the workforce. They stop them from setting up a business. And in some cases, and it's what infuriates me the most, it's in places where women can't even own land or the property that they need to run a business, despite the fact that if you enable the women to be able to engage in business, you're going to see the economic returns that empowering them brings. We know it, we see it. The reports and the studies have shown that when women are empowered and able to engage in trade, you see job creation, you see poverty alleviation, and you see economic growth. And so I would argue, if we could eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, I think we'd see tremendous gains in per capita productivity. And in fact, there's numbers that back it up that say eliminate all that discrimination and you get a rise in productivity by 40%. So we have all the facts and figures that make the case to have gender equity in global trade. And we were advancing a really powerful agenda. Susan and I talked about many of the steps that we were taking last year at last year's conference, and then COVID-19 happened. And I think it was a little bit of a setback just because of the impact of COVID-19 on women. The reality is, all of us can recognize that COVID-19 dramatically disrupted social and economic, aspects of our communities. But we're still seeing what the longer term implications are for the economy and international trade. We've seen, though, in these early analyses that the economic shocks that have come from COVID-19 have really affected men and women differently. And I think in many ways that helps us reinforce the argument for why now more than ever we really do have to start looking at trade through a gender lens to really not only address how to empower women to be part of economic growth, but how to empower women to be able to recover from some of the lasting effects of the pandemic. Just to be a little bit more specific about the impacts, women are being impacted differently by the crisis because women represent about 70% of the healthcare workforce, according to the World Health Organization. So think about that. In the pandemic, the women are the ones that are in the front lines trying to battle this crisis, but not exactly being empowered in that process. Women also constitute the majority of the part-time and contract health workers who often don't have access to paid sick leave. And what does that do? That further exacerbates that healthcare industry's 28% gender wage gap. Women workers also make up the majority of the employees in many of the sectors that are thought of as essential and are actually keeping countries running. But if you think about it, women are also some of the ones that have been negatively impacted by many of the COVID shutdowns. And when I think about it, one of the trade sectors that's near and dear to my heart is the services sector. And that's probably been one of the most directly affected sectors in the economy because of the imposition of restrictions on travel, on transport of goods, in addition to the fact that you've seen a lot of retail and hospitality being subject to these shutdowns and limited access orders. And so given that 55% of the women are employed in the services sector, women are most likely to be affected by closures and restrictions. Women also, in fact, make up, I think it's 57% of workers in retail, a sector that even through the pandemic and post-pandemic is undergoing massive transformation because of how the coronavirus has affected how customers shop. And so while most services have been harmed by the COVID-19 crisis, some services I will acknowledge have benefit. Think of like telecommunications and technology services. But the problem is women aren't really present as much in those sectors. Okay, so add on to all of that. You think about, okay, developed economies, but then do a deeper dive in terms of what you see in more of the developing world. In the developing world, women make up the largest portion of the workers in the informal economy. They're often part-timers, they're often on contract. And so with some of the analysis, it's shown that like in places like South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, if you look at those numbers, over 80%, 74%, 54%, depending on the regions, have women in non-agricultural jobs that are part of this informal economy. And when you're in the informal economy, you are subject to a lot of precarious labor market arrangements because women are considered oftentimes that part of the workforce that can be easily laid off if there's an economic downturn. And of course, we've seen a lot of that economic downturn with the pandemic. Add on to it, during the pandemic, we at UPS have also seen a lot of concern in terms of supply chain disruptions. Some of the sectors characterized by really complex supply chains, particularly think about electronics and automotive products, have really seen trade fall off. You have a lot of women engaged in some of these supply chains. And in the case of small and medium-sized businesses that participate in global value chains, suppliers have had additional challenges. Think about cash flow as payment terms have lengthened, and unpredictable shifts in their own procurement abilities to be able to get key production inputs, just because a lot of the cargo movements have been limited with a lot of the border closures and lockdowns. And so the biggest challenge for SMEs has been throughout this crisis how to manage supply chain disruption. And that really requires a risk versus an economic efficiency calculation. So amid all of this uncertainty and lack of liquidity, SMEs are often turning to loans and other lines of credit in order to survive. And guess what? In the case of women entrepreneurs, access to financing before the pandemic was already challenging. Now it's even more scarce. And so when you can't figure out how to get that extra financing, that extra liquidity to keep your supply chains going, we're finding that a lot of women-owned businesses in particular are having a hard time, being able to re-engage in the global economy. And so when, women don't have access to that financial wherewithal, it's really hard for businesses to thrive. And add on top of that, all of the challenges of the COVID pandemic with women having to do double duty, not just running their businesses when they can keep them running or going to work when they still have a job, but then also they're managing all of the childcare and the schooling. And so I feel like the women of the world are like holding it all up. And that's why we need to get policymakers to get energized about recognizing that the first place they need to turn to foster economic recovery out of the pandemic is focus on women. So if it wasn't true before this crisis, it is definitely true now. Women have been the hardest hit. women need the most help up, and women need to have all those barriers that have been traditionally put in their place eliminated, so that they can be part of the biggest aspect of economic recovery possible, because communities and countries are depending on that. I will say, for UPS, we were completely blessed. I mean, the logistics industry was deemed an essential industry, and so it gave us the ability to continue to keep the flow of trade, going. And so while we were managing the exponential growth of e-commerce, we really saw the opportunity that it brought for small and medium-sized businesses to be able to really harness the power of digital trade. And so when we got the opportunity, we decided to marry up that advocacy that we've always done for small and medium-sized businesses up with advocacy for women, because that combination we knew would be a powerful policy call to action if we could share some of the experiences of what we were seeing during this pandemic and how the focus on women was really needed. And we were actually invited by the Women 20, which is the W20. So think G20, but think of the focus being given on the W20, which is all women in the G20 countries, to write a joint policy paper to highlight women's empowerment through digital trade. And so we really used a lot of the learnings we've been getting through this pandemic to really say that, gender considerations need to be more mainstreamed into the G20 discussions. And I'm going to tell you all privately, we took the opportunity to talk about these issues in the W20, but I really wanted it happening in the B20 and the G20, because women's issues shouldn't be relegated just to women's forums. These issues should be a part of all good business discussions and part of every government's, discussions about what they need to be doing to foster economic recovery. And in the paper that we did for the W20, though, we already knew the research, and we shared the fact that the gender gap contributes to lower economic output, and that if you address obstacles to women's participation in trade, you'll really be able to facilitate economic growth, and we would argue build market resilience. And so we at UPS have continued to argue that closing the digital divide and enabling women entrepreneurs to tap into digital trade and e-commerce is so critical to spurring global economic recovery. And we've said that the public, private, and civil sectors can really narrow that global gender divide by promoting digital connectivity and programs that really support women-owned and women-led businesses engaging in e-commerce. And Susan and I, will be one of the biggest champions of what the USMCA accomplished in that regard, because there was a huge focus on women's issues, but also e-commerce and the provisions needed for digital trade. And we need to keep up those advocacy efforts. And so UPS is doing its part right now as part of this private sector effort to help address this skills gap. So 2 years ago, way before the pandemic, we launched the UPS Women's Exporter Program to offer training, workshops, mentorship, and market access tools to women entrepreneurs around the world to really help them navigate the complexities of cross-border trade. And a big part of this, especially in the COVID-19 context, has been leveraging e-commerce and meeting the expectations of online consumers in order to help women-owned businesses continue expanding their businesses, even while brick and mortar shops had to be closed. And we've seen how women that never set up on an online presence have been able to enter the world of e-commerce and have been able to rethink some of their business strategies and reach more customers in spite of the pandemic. And so from our part, UPS wants to continue to serve as an expert resource on how to succeed in digital trade. But we're only one part of the equation, as I've said. governments have a significant role to play in ensuring that this enabling environment is in place and that barriers to access for women especially are dismantled so that we really level the playing field for all potential traders. And I've long said, make it easier for women to trade, you're going to make it easier for everyone to trade. And so if we can get governments, and the Canadian government in particular has been such a powerful champion here, but if we can get more governments around the world to eliminate those legal and regulatory barriers, private sector companies like UPS will be there helping, businesses be able to engage in trade and use digital trade to be able to get their products and services anywhere and everywhere around the world. We'll help keep supply chains robust because that's our business. We're all about logistics, but we need a partnership with governments to really be able to eliminate those barriers that prevent women from being able to grow their businesses. We know the economics will prove it out if governments act, and we as a business partner are ready to support, but we've got to do this all together. And if the pandemic hasn't been a rallying cry for some, it needs to be now a rallying cry for all. So in closing, I just say that as a global community, we've faced a lot of challenges, but I really want to end on a high note. I have always said that I believe in the power of positive. I knew at the outset of this crisis that we would turn the corner as a global community through the strength of logistics, because logistics would be part of the solution for keeping businesses going, whether it had to be using digital means or not, but that there is this resilience that exists within all of us. And if we tap into that, I know we can turn the corner on some of the business and economic challenges we're all facing. And here's where the power of networking and women supporting each other is more important than ever. And so I got to say, Go for the Greens is such an important, conference that I was so glad we kept it going virtually, because that networking is so important in terms of helping to share some of the best practices and also creating those coalitions of allies that can be the advocates for change with governments. And so count on UPS to keep delivering not just the everyday things that you need at your house. Count on us to deliver those vaccines. We are ready to serve our global community in terms of helping us turn that corner, but also count on us to keep a very powerful partnership that we have right now with our foundation, with the International Trade Center through the She Trades Initiative, helping women entrepreneurs around the globe, work around the barriers that exist and engage in trade. Because I think there's great power in us coming together, sharing best practices, sharing tools, and advocating for the elimination of discrimination and advocacy for truly, inclusive trade. We can beat this pandemic, show the world what women stand for, and really show the power of resiliency that's built into enabling a woman to engage in trade. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you all. And it's great to see all of the participants on this virtual conference, because it says that, we are together an unstoppable force, and we just got to keep the world moving forward and delivering what matters for women entrepreneurs everywhere and anywhere in the world. So with that, I look forward to taking any questions that anybody has.
Laura, thank you. I know we would be applauding very loudly in the chat. People are saying,
Yeah.
"Atta girl," and thanking you for being a champion for all of us, small business owners and women. So thank you so much. We do have several questions, and I know you have a hard stop in about 8 minutes or so. So we're going to, if you don't mind. So one question was from Jimena, and she asked if you've seen an increase in North American women exporters in the years that you've been focusing on this issue before COVID. have you seen an increase in,
Non.
I'm sorry, in non-North American women exporters?
You know, it's pockets. It's pockets of activity that we're seeing. It depends on where governments working in partnership with the private sector have really worked to support women-owned businesses. 2 years ago, I served as the U.S. government delegate for the APEC Business Advisory Council, and we were really trying to foster more programming across the APEC countries, so that's the Asia Pacific, and where governments were systematic and purposeful in terms of understanding the barriers for women-owned businesses and eliminate them, and where they were creating kind of the forums for partnership, we did see a rise. But where women were left, so to speak, left to their own devices and could only use traditional networking means, oftentimes we saw a lot of the growth capped. And that's why we're trying to elevate this to more of a global level. The Canadian government is doing this as well, trying to make it so that every government is making this a priority and not just making it the women's issue. We're trying to make it the economic growth imperative, and saying that this is a part of your country or your population whose potential has been untapped. And here's the 5 things you can do to make that change. Obviously, we're working in partnership with organizations like the ITC and She Trades, but like I said, it's pockets. And I think a lot of times it's because women aren't empowered and enabled in enough places around the world.
Exactly. What do you think is the issue to making this difficult for women having access to the funds they need to grow and to do global trade?
I think it's 3 things. One, it's the laws and regulations on the books. I mean, there are ridiculous laws and regulations that are out there that say if a woman wants to open a bank account, she needs a male co-signer. I mean, how are you supposed to get access to financing if you don't even have a bank account? 2, oftentimes women aren't allowed to own property in their own names, or they have to have a male, counterpart listed on the property. How are you supposed to get access to financing if you have to ask, the male counterpart to go in with you? There's a lot of sociocultural elements to it too, in that I think there's still unconscious bias against women about whether, well, are they going to really be able to repay the loans? And I'll share with you, before I joined UPS, I was at Citigroup, and it was one of the most important efforts that we had underway to show that women are actually better repayers of loans than men. And there was a great study that Citigroup launched to prove that point. And we're trying to get that information out so that you can get people to rethink their biases about whether women will or will not repay, and show the facts. When women are given monies to grow their businesses, they're more likely to pay that loan back. And we just have to keep telling those stories, because we need to prove some of the unfair, perspectives that people hold, prove them wrong, and show that women are great to invest in, and women-owned businesses are even better to invest in, not just for repayment of loans, but also for the ripple effect that happens in communities.
We have more.
Yeah.
We have more questions coming, and some of them will
sure.
be answered in the next panel,
Okay.
such as how to get started in trade exporting. Nancy Allen asked if you could tell us more about the GW.
The W20?
I think she meant the W20. Yes, a little bit.
So the lead this year for the G20 is Saudi Arabia, of all countries, right? And I have been such a big champion with the allies within Saudi Arabia, really powerful women who are saying Saudi Arabia's economy needs greater diversification, and the greatest untapped potential that exists in that country is its women. And it's through discussions that we've had with Princess Rima and other senior leaders in the Saudi government that they took on board this notion of, and I shouldn't say it's a notion, this idea of really having a more robust dialogue about how the issues about engaging women in public policy as well as the economy were critically important. And they created the W20 grouping so that issues could be brought to the surface. We had been pushing to have those issues brought into the B20, which is a grouping of businesses.
Yeah.
But you know what? You'll take every baby step that you can as long as you're moving forward. And this was a positive move forward because it gave us an opportunity to be able to advance all of the issues that we're seeing that hold women back, that require a rethink. And I think it's kind of powerful that Saudi Arabia is the country that's fostering that, right? If Saudi Arabia can do this, what is the problem with the rest of the countries, I would say. So
Exactly. Thank you for that.
Wow.
And I think we have one more question, and we'll make it as quick as we can. Does your advocacy also include lenders and venture capitalists and angel investors? Are they part of the Women Exporters program with you?
So we play to our strengths, right? We're a logistics company. So in a lot of our webinars and our exporting programs and some of the training sessions we provide, we focus on trade. We focus on the customs issues, how to get trade financing, you know, how to complete all the paperwork, how to ensure your intellectual property is protected, how to make sure you're meeting the standards that are set by other countries. But we're not engaged as much in the areas on the venture capital side or the angel investing. But we have a lot of partners with us in this women's economic empowerment effort. So the Citigroups of the world, the MasterCards, the JP Morgan Chases are partners with us, and that is their expertise. And we're trying to create a coalition of women's economic empowerment through those partnerships. And so in some cases, we've done webinars where we've partnered with Citigroup, we've partnered with technology companies like HP and Oracle. We bring to the table our expertise, and we partner with other companies that bring their expertise. And by the way, it is not intended to be, you know, a sales pitch for UPS or any of those companies. Right. We're not trying to sell our business. We're trying to empower more economic activity, because we actually think that if you empower more economic activity, the opportunity for us to pitch our businesses will come. But if women are sidelined, we only get to serve 50% of the population. We want to serve the world. So.
Ooh, wow.
Thank you, Laura.
That's so...
We know we need to get you off